In 1990, a teenage girl from Oregon vanished without a trace, leaving her mom and dad without answers for over 2 decades. But 22 years later, her father flips through an old school yearbook of hers. And what he notices in that moment changes everything. The fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, blanketing the coastal town of Mornington, Oregon, in its customary morning shroud. Frank Sanders stood at the window of his daughter's bedroom, watching as the mist swirled around the lighthouse point in the distance. The scenic beauty of this small town, with its thick woods and dramatic cliffs overlooking the ocean, had always been a source of comfort for him until 22 years ago when his daughter vanished without a trace. Frank turned away from the window, his eyes scanning the untouched bedroom. Everything was exactly as Alicia had left it that spring day in 1990, a few weeks after her high school graduation. Posters still clung to the walls. Her desk remained organized with textbooks and notebooks, her closet still full of clothes that hadn't been worn in over 2 decades. "It's time," he whispered to himself, recalling the conversation he'd had with his wife Elaine the previous night. They had finally agreed that after 22 years, they needed to accept that Alicia was never coming back. Today was the day they would sort through her belongings, donate what could be useful to children in need, and move the rest to the attic. Frank opened the window to let in fresh air, immediately disturbing years of settled dust. He sneezed and wiped his eyes, then moved to the closet and began taking out Alicia's clothes. Each item brought back memories. Her favorite blue sweater, the dress she wore to her junior prom, the faded jeans with patches she had sewn on herself. He worked methodically, placing items in different boxes, one for donation, one for storage, one for keepsakes. When he reached her school supplies, he hesitated. These represented his daughter's aspirations, her future that never came to be. She had been accepted to the University of Oregon, planning to study marine biology. As Frank sorted through textbooks and binders, he came across a book he didn't recognize, Alicia's high school yearbook. Surprisingly, he realized he had never looked through it before. In those painful days after her disappearance, neither he nor Elaine could bear to see Alicia's smiling face captured in those pages, frozen in time with classmates who had gone on to live their lives. Frank sat on the edge of the bed and opened the yearbook. The weight of it in his hands felt significant, like he was holding a piece of his daughter's life that had remained unexplored. He flipped through the glossy pages until he found Alicia's senior portrait. Her smile, so bright and hopeful, sent a familiar jab of pain through his heart. 22 years, he whispered, running his finger over her face. "I need to learn to keep you in my heart without this pain, sweetheart." His eyes drifted to the photo beside Alicia's, her best friend, Amy Davidson. Amy's face brought back memories of sleepovers, dinner at their table, the girls laughing and whispering secrets. Frank realized he hadn't heard anything about Amy in years. After Alicia disappeared, Amy had visited regularly for a few months, but eventually those visits stopped. Curious, Frank flipped to the section with individual student profiles. Each senior had a page with a short biography and personal quotes. He found Alicia's page and read her words written when she had her whole life ahead of her. "Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me. To my teachers who pushed me to do better, and to my best friend Amy. Don't forget to return my book, The Secret Garden, Illustrated Classic Edition. You old grandma, love you forever." Frank chuckled, the sound caught between sweetness and bitterness. The light-hearted jab at Amy was so typical of their friendship. He turned the page to find Amy's profile, reading about her dreams and aspirations. Her biography spoke about drive, following dreams, and standing up for yourself. Frank's mind returned to the book Alicia had mentioned. The Secret Garden had been her favorite since childhood. She had collected different editions of it. Had Amy ever returned it? He couldn't recall seeing it among Alicia's things. Driven by curiosity, Frank began searching through the boxes of Alicia's books. The dust in the room made his eyes water and his nose run, so he decided to take the boxes to the living room where he could breathe more easily. In the living room, he methodically emptied the boxes, arranging books and magazines on the coffee table and floor. There were fantasy novels, science textbooks, nature magazines, but no illustrated edition of The Secret Garden. Frank wondered if Amy still had it after all these years. On a whim, he checked the back of the yearbook and found a section where students had written their contact information. Amy had scribbled her phone number with a note. "Call me anytime, BFF." Frank reached for his phone and dialed the number, not expecting it to still be in service after 22 years. As anticipated, the automated message informed him the number was no longer in use. Just then, the front door opened and Elaine walked in carrying grocery bags from the farmer's market. She stopped abruptly, taking in the scene of books and magazines scattered across their living room. "Frank, what is all this?" Her voice was sharp with surprise and something deeper. "Pain. I was just going through Alicia's things like we planned," Frank explained, standing up. Elaine's face hardened. "We agreed to sort and store her things, not spread them all over the house. I thought we were finally moving forward, not dwelling in the past again." "I'm not dwelling, Elaine. I found her yearbook and was looking for something. What could possibly be so important?" Elaine set her grocery bags on the kitchen counter, her movements stiff with anger. Frank showed her the yearbook, pointing to Alicia's note about the book. "She mentioned a book that Amy borrowed. I was curious if it was among her things." Elaine sighed heavily. "A book? Frank. It doesn't matter anymore. Alicia's books are just gathering dust. We shouldn't bother Amy with this. She's probably forgotten all about it, too." "Do you know where Amy is now?" Frank asked, changing the subject slightly. "Yes, I see her sometimes when I'm in town. She lives in a camper these days," Elaine replied, beginning to unpack her groceries. "I thought maybe I'd visit her," Frank said tentatively. "Not just for the book, of course. It's been so long since we've seen her, and she was like family once." Elaine stopped what she was doing and turned to face him directly. "Frank, I can't do that today. I don't have anything against Amy, but I'm not prepared to see her right now. Last night, we agreed to clean up and let go of hope. Going to see Amy today feels like the opposite of that." She gestured to the mess in the living room. "I'll stay here and clean this up. Get things ready for the attic like we planned. If you want to go, that's your choice." Frank nodded. Understanding her reluctance, it was a spontaneous idea. "I'll go alone." Elaine gave him directions to where Amy usually parked her camper, but warned, "Don't push her too hard, Frank. Alicia's disappearance must have hit her hard, too. They were like sisters." Frank gathered the yearbook, his phone, wallet, and car keys. As he headed for the door, he glanced back at Elaine, who had already begun to neatly stack Alicia's books back into boxes. He felt a pang of guilt for leaving her with the cleanup, but something was pulling him toward Amy, toward answers to questions he hadn't even formed yet. The door closed behind him as he stepped out into the misty Mornington morning, the yearbook clutched tightly against his chest. Frank drove through the winding coastal roads of Mornington, following Elaine's directions to the camper park where Amy Davidson now lived. The journey took about 20 minutes, leading him away from the town center to a modest area where several camper vans were parked along a strip overlooking a wooded area. He parked his car and looked around, trying to identify which might be Amy's. There were about a dozen campers of various sizes and conditions. Some looked permanent with small gardens planted beside them and outdoor furniture set up. Frank approached a man who was washing the windows of his RV. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Amy Davidson. Do you know which camper is hers?" The man pointed toward a blue and white camper at the far end of the lot. "That's Amy's place. Nice lady. Keeps to herself mostly." Frank thanked him and walked over to the indicated camper. It was modest but well-maintained with a small potted plant by the door. He took a deep breath and knocked. After a moment, the door opened. A woman in her early 40s stood there, her blonde hair now streaked with strands of gray, her face showing the subtle lines of middle age. She looked at Frank with polite confusion, no recognition in her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Frank realized with a start that they wouldn't recognize each other. The last time they'd seen each other, Amy had been a teenager and he had been 22 years younger. "Amy, it's Frank Sanders, Alicia's father." Her eyes widened in surprise, then filled with a mixture of emotions. Recognition, sadness, warmth. "Mr. Sanders. Oh my goodness. I please come in." She stepped back, opening the door wider. Frank climbed the 2 small steps into the compact but cozy living space. The camper was neat and decorated with personal touches, photographs, small plants, colorful pillows. "Please sit down. Would you like some coffee?" Amy gestured to a small dining area. "Coffee would be nice." "Thank you," Frank said, settling onto the bench seat. As Amy prepared the coffee, Frank noticed how her movements were deliberate, almost cautious, as if she was giving herself time to process this unexpected visit. "What brings you here after all these years?" she asked, placing a steaming mug in front of him before sitting down across the table. Frank pulled out the yearbook he'd brought with him. "I found this today while cleaning out Alicia's room. I realized I'd never actually looked through it before." Amy's eyes fixed on the book. "I remember this," she said softly, reaching out to touch the cover. Frank opened it to Alicia's profile page and pointed to the note about returning the book. "I was curious about this book," she mentioned. "Did you ever return it to her?" Amy's expression softened into a sad smile. "No, I didn't. I was such a forgetful girl back then, and Alicia knew it. She always teased me about it." She got up and moved to a cabinet beneath her bed. After rummaging for a moment, she pulled out a worn copy of The Secret Garden, Illustrated Classic Edition. "I kept forgetting to return it, and then after she disappeared, I couldn't part with it. It's the last thing I have from her." Amy held the book carefully as if it were made of delicate glass. "Would you mind terribly if I kept it? It's become very precious to me over the years." Frank nodded, understanding completely. "Of course, you can keep it." He took the book when Amy handed it to him, opening it gently. The pages were yellowed with age, but the illustrations were still vibrant. As he flipped through, he paused at a page that had been used as a bookmark. It looked like a torn page from a youth fashion magazine. Frank unfolded the page to reveal a photo shoot featuring teenage models. A young boy in stylish clothes caught his eye. Something about him seemed familiar. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing to the model. Amy leaned forward to look. "That's Jason Murray, he was in our class." Frank turned back to the yearbook and found Jason's photo near Alicia's. "I remember now. He was quite talented to be modeling at that age. He still models occasionally from what I hear. He has his own fashion line now," Amy said. Frank looked up. "You know, Elaine once mentioned that you were dating Jason back then. I didn't pay much attention at the time." Amy's expression changed immediately. "That's not true at all. I never dated Jason. In fact, I never even liked him. He was actually close with Alicia for a while." This caught Frank by surprise. "Alicia? She and Elaine never mentioned anything about Jason to me. It was during our junior year in grade 11, about a year before graduation," Amy explained. "Jason seemed to have a crush on Alicia for a few months, but it didn't last long. Once we realized what kind of person he really was, we both stayed away from him. Alicia never mentioned him again." Amy paused, seeming to recall something. "Actually, now that I think about it, I did see them talking a few times during senior year. They seemed close, which was strange because we'd agreed he was bad news. Alicia even asked me some odd questions about him." "What kind of questions?" Frank asked. His interest peaked. She asked if I thought someone like Jason just needed help to change, if maybe he wasn't as bad as we thought. She even asked me to drive past his house once because she wanted to see where he lived. I thought it was weird at the time, but Alicia always had such a soft heart. She wanted to see the good in everyone. Franked. Did the police know about this when they investigated her disappearance? Yes, I told them, Amy confirmed. They questioned everyone in our class, including Jason. But by that time, Alicia was dating Brandon Knox. He was their main suspect at first. Frank nodded. I remember Brandon. He used to come to the house to pick her up. We were suspicious of him, too, but he had a solid alibi for when she disappeared. Do you know what happened to Brandon? Frank asked. Last I heard, he left town not long after Alicia vanished. The scrutiny was too much for him, I think. Frank's mind was racing. And Jason? What about him? I'm not sure about any relationship between them, Amy said. Alicia rarely showed any interest in him other than those few curious questions. Frank glanced once more at Jason's photo in the magazine. Why would Alicia have used his page as a bookmark? And the fact that she'd been close to him without either Frank or Elaine knowing that felt important. He brought it up to Amy and she said, it was from Alicia's favorite magazine. I hated him so much that Alicia tore out the page with his face on it. She just folded it and said there was nothing better for it than to be used as a bookmark. Frank thought for a moment, then nodded. Do you know where Jason is now? He asked. Amy picked up her phone and scrolled through some messages. Actually, our high school alumni group just had a reunion last weekend at Jason's house. I didn't go, but they shared his address in the group chat. She showed Frank the message. Would you mind sending me that address? Frank asked, pulling out his phone. They exchanged numbers, and Amy forwarded him the information. Do you think Jason might be involved somehow? Amy asked hesitantly. I don't know, Frank admitted. But I'd like the police to know about his relationship with Alicia, however brief it was. The fact that neither Elaine nor I knew about it makes me curious. When Alicia started dating Brandon, it was completely open and transparent. Frank stood up, thanking Amy for her time and the information. As he prepared to leave, Amy touched his arm. Please tell Elaine I said hello, she said. And thank you for letting me keep the book. It means more to me than you know. Frank nodded, the yearbook tucked under his arm as he stepped back out into the afternoon light, his mind filled with new questions about his daughter's life and her disappearance. Frank sat in his car, the yearbook resting on the passenger seat beside him. His mind was racing with the new information Amy had shared. The revelation that Alicia had been close to Jason Murray, however briefly, was unsettling, not because of Jason himself, but because Frank and Elaine had never known about it. He took out his phone and dialed Detective Ron Keller, the officer who had been assigned to Alicia's case all those years ago. Frank knew the detective had retired now, but still lived in town. The call went to voicemail, not surprising for a Sunday afternoon. Frank stared at his phone, then at the address Amy had sent him. He should go home to Elaine. He knew that he had promised her they would close this chapter of their lives today. But something about what Amy had said, and the bookmark kept gnawing at him. Alicia's curiosity about Jason's home, her questions about whether he could change. Just a quick drive-by, he muttered to himself, starting the car. Just to see where it is. 20 minutes later, Frank found himself in one of Mornington's more affluent neighborhoods. Large houses with manicured lawns lined the quiet streets, a stark contrast to the modest home where he and Elaine had raised Alicia. He located Jason's address, a sprawling two-story house with a circular driveway and professional landscaping. The property was significantly larger than the surrounding homes, speaking to Jason's success since high school. Frank parked his car across the street at a distance, observing the house. The front gate was open, and as he watched, a man emerged from the front door, accompanied by a young woman. Even from this distance, Frank could recognize an older version of the boy from the yearbook. Jason Murray, now in his early 40s, still handsome, with the confidence of someone accustomed to success. Jason walked the woman to her car, kissed her cheek, and waved as she drove away. As he turned to go back inside, his gaze drifted across the street and landed on Frank's car. Frank realized too late that his car windows didn't have tinting, making him clearly visible. Jason's posture changed, becoming alert and suspicious. Frank decided there was no point in hiding now. He turned off the engine, got out of the car, and approached the gate. "Good afternoon," Frank called out, trying to sound casual. "Jason Murray, isn't it?" Jason didn't return the friendly greeting. "Who are you and why are you watching my house?" he demanded, his tone instantly hostile. "Are you paparazzi?" "A reporter." "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude," Frank said, stopping at a respectful distance. "My name is Frank Sanders. I'm Alicia Sanders' father. She was in your graduating class and went missing 22 years ago." Jason's expression changed instantly, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" Frank was taken back by the coldness of Jason's response. "I heard there was a class reunion here last weekend. I'm just trying to gather some information about my daughter. I was told you might have been close to her at one point." "Who told you that?" "Amy." Jason's voice was sharp. "She didn't even come to the reunion." Frank tried to keep his tone calm. "I'm not looking for trouble, just some answers. It's been 22 years and we still don't know what happened to Alicia." "Why are you asking me?" Jason replied defensively. "I was never even Alicia's boyfriend. I barely knew her and was never attracted to her. I told the police that back then, and I don't appreciate being questioned about it again." Frank was confused by the intensity of Jason's reaction. "I never suggested you were her boyfriend. I just heard you were close at one point. If we ever talked at school, it was probably because I borrowed money or needed help with homework," Jason said dismissively. "I always returned what I borrowed. There was never a problem between us. I told the police everything back then." Despite his casual words, Frank noticed how Jason's body language had become increasingly tense. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting around as if checking whether anyone else was watching. "I don't understand why you're suddenly showing up at my house asking these questions," Jason continued. "I have a reputation to maintain now. I don't want any reporter or the public seeing us together and spreading rumors." Before Frank could respond, Jason turned and strode back toward his house. "You should leave," he called over his shoulder. "I have nothing else to say about Alicia Sanders." Frank stood there, stunned by the encounter. Jason's reaction seemed disproportionate to his simple questions. Why would a successful businessman be so defensive about a brief high school friendship from over 2 decades ago? As Jason disappeared inside his house, Frank slowly walked back to his car. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. He felt foolish and ashamed for coming here, for pushing when Elaine had asked him to let go. "What was I thinking?" he muttered to himself. "I promised Elaine we'd close this chapter today, not reopen old wounds." He started the car, casting one last glance at Jason's house before driving away. If Elaine knew he had come here instead of helping with the cleanup at home, she would be hurt and angry. Frank had allowed himself to be pulled back into the vortex of questions and possibilities that had consumed the first years after Alicia's disappearance. As he drove back toward town, Frank tried to convince himself to let it go. Jason's hostile reaction was probably nothing more than annoyance at having his Sunday afternoon interrupted by a reminder of a tragic event from his youth. Anyone would be uncomfortable being spontaneously questioned about a missing person case after so many years. Yet something about Jason's defensiveness nagged at Frank. It seemed excessive, almost panicked. Was it just the surprise of being confronted unexpectedly? Or was there something more? Frank shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the road. He had promised Elaine they would move forward today. He needed to honor that promise and stop chasing ghosts from the past. As Frank drove back into town, his mind kept replaying the strange encounter with Jason Murray. The man's hostility had been unexpected and unsettling. Frank knew he should go home to Elaine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something important. Almost without conscious decision, he found himself turning toward Mornington Memorial Funeral Home. If he and Elaine were truly going to close this chapter of their lives, perhaps it was time to consider a formal memorial service for Alicia, even without a body to bury. The funeral home was quiet when Frank entered. A gentle-faced receptionist greeted him and after hearing his purpose, provided him with brochures detailing services and prices. Frank thanked her and brochures in hand, walked back to his car. As he opened his car door, a flicker of movement across the street caught his eye. Jason Murray was heading into a hardware store. Then, just moments later, he reappeared at the cashier holding a shovel and a small wooden box. Frank froze. His gaze locked on Jason as he loaded the items into his car. Frank ducked into his own car, not wanting to be seen. Through his rear-view mirror, he watched as Jason walked to the floral shop next door to the hardware store. A few minutes later, Jason emerged carrying a bouquet of white hyacinths. White hyacinths, Alicia's favorite flowers. A chill ran down Frank's spine. It could be a coincidence, of course. Plenty of people liked white hyacinths, but combined with Jason's earlier behavior and the shovel. Frank's heart pounded as Jason placed the flowers in his car and drove away. Without allowing himself to think about the consequences, Frank started his car and followed at a safe distance. Jason drove through town and then took the coastal road leading toward Whitlow Cliff, an area known for its dramatic ocean views and the few vacation properties scattered along its wooded slopes. Frank maintained a careful distance, not wanting to be spotted. Eventually, Jason turned onto a private drive leading to a small cottage perched near the edge of the cliff. Frank drove past, then parked his car further up the road where the trees provided cover. He watched as Jason unlocked the cottage door and went inside. A few minutes later, Jason emerged carrying a gallon container of water. He placed it in a small garden trolley along with the shovel, the wooden box, and the bouquet of white hyacinths. Jason began walking away from the cottage, following a narrow path that led toward the cliff's edge. Frank got out of his car and moved through the brush down the slope toward the cottage, staying hidden among the trees. A growing sense of urgency propelled him forward. Frank waited until Jason was a good distance ahead before carefully following him again. The path wound through scrubby pines and flowering shrubs, eventually opening to a secluded overlook with a breathtaking view of the Pacific Ocean. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. From behind a large rock formation, Frank observed as Jason selected a spot near the cliff's edge. The man looked around cautiously, as if making sure he was alone, then began digging with the shovel. The rocky soil resisted his efforts, indicating it had been a long time since the ground had last been disturbed. After digging a hole about 2 feet deep, Jason set aside the shovel and knelt beside the hole. He opened the wooden box and stared at its contents for a long moment. From Frank's hiding spot, Frank couldn't see what was inside, but Jason's expression was thoughtful, almost reverent. His lips moved silently, as if reading or perhaps reliving memories. He shuffled through the papers in his hands, reading each one carefully, taking his time. Finally, Jason closed the box, but before he could secure the lid, a sudden gust of wind swept across the cliff. Papers from inside the box were scattered in all directions. Jason cursed and quickly closed the box before more contents could escape, then scrambled to collect the pieces of paper that had blown around the area. Once he had gathered the loose papers, Jason placed the wooden box into the hole. He laid the bouquet of white hyacinths on top, then began filling the hole with soil. He worked methodically, patting down the earth and pouring water over the mound to compact it. When he had finished, Jason stood over the unmarked grave for a long moment. Then, in a voice just loud enough for Frank to hear over the sound of the ocean waves, he spoke. "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. He jerked backward in shock, his foot slipping on loose pebbles. He caught himself against a tree trunk, freezing in place and clamping his mouth shut to prevent any sound from escaping. His heart hammered so loudly in his chest that he was certain Jason would hear it. Jason's head snapped up, scanning the surrounding brush. "Hello," he called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Is someone there?" Frank remained perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Jason picked up the shovel and walked a few steps toward the brush where Frank was hiding. He paused, listening intently, then took another step forward. Frank pressed himself against the trunk of the tree, praying that the shadows would conceal him. After what seemed like an eternity, Jason stepped back. "Just the wind," he muttered, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He cast one more suspicious glance around the area before gathering his supplies. Instead of returning the way he had come, Jason walked the perimeter of the clearing as if making sure no one was watching him. Finally satisfied, he headed back toward the cottage, the empty water container and trolley in hand. He leaned the shovel against the side of the cottage before he got into his car and left. Frank waited, counting slowly to 100 red to make sure Jason wasn't coming back. When the area remained quiet, he cautiously emerged from his hiding place. His legs felt weak, but determination drove him forward toward the freshly disturbed earth. He needed to know what was in that box. He needed to know why Jason had spoken his daughter's name over what looked disturbingly like a grave. Frank retrieved the shovel from where Jason had left it by the cottage and returned to the burial site. He began to dig, his movements frantic yet cautious. The soil was still damp and easy to move. Within minutes he had uncovered the bouquet of white hyacinths, their perfume filling the air as he set them carefully aside. Just as Frank's shovel struck the wooden box, a voice behind him made his blood run cold. "I knew someone was out there. I was right." Frank spun around to find Jason standing a few yards away, his expression a mixture of rage and triumph. "You shouldn't have come back," Jason said, advancing slowly. "I saw your car parked up the hill, so I circled back through the woods. What do you think you're doing?" Frank gripped the shovel tightly, both as a tool to continue his work and as a potential weapon if needed. "I heard you say my daughter's name," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "What have you buried here, Jason? What does Alicia have to do with this?" Jason's face contorted. "You don't know what you're talking about. You shouldn't be here." Frank turned back to the partially excavated hole, determined to uncover the box. "I'm going to find out what's in there." "Stop!" Jason shouted, pulling out a gun. "Drop the shovel." Frank immediately raised his hands in the air, and Jason lunged forward, reaching for the shovel from Jason's hand. "Sir." A female officer helped Frank to his feet. "Yes," Frank managed, his voice raspy. "Thank you." As the officers led Jason to a police car, Frank pointed toward the freshly disturbed earth. "There. He just buried something there. He mentioned my daughter's name, Alicia Sanders. She disappeared 22 years ago." The officer's expression became serious. "Sanders? I remember that case. Let me get Detective Ramirez over here." While a few officers moved to secure the scene, Detective Ramirez approached Frank and handed him back his phone. "Mr. Sanders, I'm Detective Ramirez. Can you tell me what happened here?" Frank explained everything. Finding the yearbook, visiting Amy, his strange encounter with Jason at his home, and how he had followed Jason to this cliff. "I know I shouldn't have followed him," Frank admitted. "But when I saw him by a shovel and white hyacinths, Alicia's favorite flowers, something just didn't feel right." Detective Ramirez nodded. "You said he buried something here." Frank pointed to the fresh mound of earth. "He buried a wooden box in the flowers. Before that, the wind blew some papers out of the box, and he gathered them up. And he said something about Alicia holding these memories. Now, the detective motioned to a forensic team that had arrived. Let's see what we've got. As the forensic team carefully excavated the site, Frank watched with growing apprehension. The first item they uncovered was the bouquet of white hyacinths, still fresh and pristine. Beneath it lay the wooden box. The lead forensic technician opened the box carefully, revealing its contents to Detective Ramirez. Inside was a stack of papers, handwritten notes, photos, and what appeared to be printed text messages, all slightly yellowed with age. There was also a small handmade wool doll that looked like the kind children make in craft classes. Jason just buried this, Frank explained, but he said Alicia could have it now, which means he's been keeping these things at his home all this time. Detective Ramirez put on gloves and began examining the contents of the box. The first items were printouts of text messages between Jason and Alicia dating back to their high school days. As the detective read through them, her expression grew increasingly troubled. Mr. Sanders. These messages suggest that Jason and Alicia had a secret relationship during high school, she said gently. It appears it was complicated. Frank moved closer to see. The messages revealed a relationship neither he nor Elaine had known about. According to the texts, Jason and Alicia had gone out with a group of friends once, with Jason specifically asking Alicia not to bring Amy. At one point during that outing, Jason had kissed Alicia without her consent. The messages showed Alicia's initial upset followed by a gradual shift. She seemed drawn to Jason despite her misgivings, convinced that he just needed someone to love him and believe in him. Alicia repeatedly told Jason she believed he could change and become a better person. But Jason's responses were manipulative, using her affection without ever committing to her. This went on for nearly a year, Detective Ramirez noted, flipping through more messages. Then Alicia tried to end things. The later messages showed Alicia's growing frustration with the toxic relationship. When she finally broke things off and started dating Brandon Knox openly, Jason's messages became increasingly desperate, then angry. Among the photos in the box were several that made Frank turn away in horror. Explicit pictures of Alicia taken while she appeared to be restrained. The background showed a rustic interior that matched the cottage Jason had just come from, as well as various locations in the surrounding woods. Detective Ramirez quickly covered these photos, but turned them over to examine the backs. Each one had handwriting. Jason's, they presumed, scrolled across the back. One photo had the same sentence repeated dozens of times, filling the entire back. You must still love me. You must still love me. You must still love me. Another bore the inscription. Had a great time at the cliffs with you. Yours, Jay. The most disturbing was on the back of a photo where Alicia's face showed clear fear. Here, Jason had written a rambling note about how he couldn't keep it together anymore, that people were searching for Alicia and that she, referred to with a profanity, refused to talk things out with him. The note ended with an apology that he had to kill her because otherwise they would find her and capture him, adding that she would always be in his heart, even without anyone knowing about their relationship. We'll need to question Jason about the details of how he killed Alicia. Detective Ramirez said quietly to another officer. He doesn't explicitly say in these notes. As they continued to examine the evidence, another team of officers who had been searching the surrounding area approached urgently. Detective, we found something, one of them said, her voice grim. About 15 feet from here, there's an area where the soil composition is different. We did a preliminary excavation and we found bone fragments. Frank's legs gave way beneath him and he sank to the ground. After 22 years of uncertainty and false hope, the awful truth was finally emerging. The forensic team expanded their search, carefully digging in the indicated area. As the afternoon wore on, they uncovered more and more of Alicia's remains. Detective Ramirez approached Frank, who had been sitting silently watching the excavation. Mr. Sanders, would you like us to call your wife? She should know about this. Frank nodded numbly. Yes, and please contact Amy Davidson, too. She was Alicia's best friend. She deserves to know. As they waited for Elaine and Amy to arrive, the detective suggested Frank might want to wait at the station, but he refused. No, I need to stay here, he said firmly. They should see this, all of it, before anything is moved. We've waited 22 years for answers. I need to see this through to the end. When Elaine arrived an hour later, her face was pale with shock. She ran to Frank and they clung to each other as Detective Ramirez gently explained what they had found. Amy arrived shortly after, her eyes red from crying during the drive over. The three of them stood together at the edge of the crime scene, united in grief as the full extent of what had happened to Alicia was revealed. Elaine turned to the detective, her voice shaking, but determined. We want to move her remains from here. She deserves a proper burial somewhere peaceful, not this terrible place where he left her. We'll arrange for that as soon as the forensic team completes their work, Detective Ramirez assured her. It shouldn't be more than a day or two. Amy stepped closer to the bone evidence, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Why didn't you tell me, Alicia? We were best friends. I could have helped you. We used to talk about girls who fell for guys like Jason and laughed together. I don't understand." As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the cliff, Frank, Elaine, and Amy stood vigil over Alicia's remains. Finally found after 22 years of searching, waiting, and wondering. She's coming home, Frank whispered, holding Elaine's hand tightly. She's finally coming home. A week later, a small flotilla of boats gathered off the coast of Mornington just below Whitlow Cliff. The day was unusually clear for the Oregon coast with sunshine streaming down on the gentle waves of the Pacific Ocean. In the lead boat were Frank and Elaine Sanders along with Amy Davidson, Detective Ron Keller, who had come out of retirement to offer his support, and Detective Ramirez, who had overseen the final resolution of Alicia's case. In the boats that followed were Alicia's former classmates, teachers, and the principal from Mornington High School. The news of Jason Murray's arrest and the discovery of Alicia's remains had spread quickly through the small coastal town, shaking a community that had never fully recovered from her disappearance 22 years earlier. Frank stood at the bow of the boat, a small urn in his hands. After careful consideration, he and Elaine had decided against a traditional cemetery burial. Instead, they chose to release Alicia's ashes into the ocean, freeing her spirit from the place where she had been confined for so long. Today, we gather to finally say goodbye to Alicia Sanders, the minister began. For 22 years, her family and friends have carried the weight of her absence, the pain of not knowing. Today, we lay that burden down and commit Alicia's remains to the sea, where she will never again be bound or restrained. Elaine stepped forward to stand beside Frank, her hand on his arm. Alicia loved the ocean, she said, her voice carrying across the water to the other boats. She was studying to become a marine biologist. She would have loved knowing that she'll become part of the sea she so adored. Frank opened the urn and together with Elaine, they scattered Alicia's ashes into the water. White hyacinth followed, tossed from every boat, creating a floating garden on the surface of the ocean. Amy came forward, tears streaming down her face, and placed the worn copy of The Secret Garden on the waves. "Goodbye, my friend," she whispered. "I'm sorry I never returned your book." After the ceremony, as the boats made their way back to shore, Detective Ramirez approached the Sanders with an update on the case. "Jason has confessed," she told them quietly. "He's given us the full story of what happened. According to Jason's confession, he had kept Alicia captive in the vacation cottage for several days after abducting her. He had been obsessed with her since their brief relationship and couldn't accept that she had moved on with Brandon Knox. He said he promised to make their relationship official if she would just break up with Brandon and tell everyone she had gone on a solo trip to celebrate graduation." Detective Ramirez explained. But Alicia refused. She told him that after years of trying to love him and believing he could change, she had finally realized he was broken beyond repair. The detective continued, her voice gentle but factual. Jason said her words hurt him deeply and they got into a physical altercation when Alicia tried to escape. They struggled at the cliff's edge and according to Jason, Alicia nearly managed to push him off. In his rage, he overpowered her and struck her multiple times with rocks. When he realized she was dead, he panicked and buried her body instead of calling for help. Amy wiped away fresh tears. I remember when Alicia started asking me about Jason, wondering if he could change. I never understood why she was so interested in him when I knew how much she disliked him. I had no idea they were secretly involved. She turned to Frank and Elaine. I'm so sorry. If I had known, maybe I could have warned her, protected her somehow. None of this is your fault, Amy, Elaine said firmly. Jason was manipulative and dangerous. Alicia believed she could help him and he took advantage of her compassion. Ron Keller, the retired detective who had spent years searching for Alicia, shook his head sadly. Since Alicia never publicly dated him and Jason had no prior record, we focused our investigation elsewhere. Brandon Knox was our main suspect at first, given that he was her known boyfriend at the time. Jason must have just continued with his life, and no one ever looked his way again. As the boats docked, Frank gazed back toward the ocean, where the white hyacinths were still visible, bobbing on the waves. 22 years of uncertainty had finally ended. The pain wasn't gone. It would never truly be gone. But there was a sense of completion, of closure. That evening, Frank and Elaine sat on their back porch, watching the sunset. Elaine had placed a framed photo of Alicia on the small table between them. Not the formal senior portrait from the yearbook, but a candid shot of her laughing on the beach, hair wild in the wind, face alive with joy. I think we can finally move forward now, Elaine said softly, reaching for Frank's hand. Not by forgetting her, but by remembering her as she truly was, vibrant, loving, full of compassion. Frank squeezed her hand. She was so much like you know, that desire to see the good in people, to help them be better. And she had your stubbornness, Elaine replied with a sad smile. Once she decided someone was worth saving, nothing could change her mind. They sat in companionable silence for a while, their shared grief no longer a wall between them, but a bond that had weathered the worst life could throw at them. I keep thinking about how young she was, Frank finally said. How innocent despite everything she believed in the power of love to transform people. It's not a bad thing to believe in, Elaine responded. The world needs more people willing to see the potential for good in others. Alicia's mistake wasn't in believing people could change. It was in thinking she alone could make it happen. Frank nodded, understanding the truth in her words. I just wish she had told us about Jason. Maybe we could have helped her see the danger. We'll never know, Elaine said gently. But I think wherever she is now, she knows how much we loved her. And she knows we never stopped looking for her. As darkness fell over Mornington, stars began to appear in the clear night sky. Frank thought about the journey that had begun a week ago when he found that yearbook. How a simple note about a borrowed book had led to answers they had sought for 22 years. The mystery of Alicia's disappearance was solved. But the deeper mystery of how to live with loss remained. Yet for the first time in decades, Frank felt a sense of peace. Alicia had been found. She was no longer lost in the unknown, but part of the sea she had loved, free and unconfined. Frank and Elaine would continue to live, to remember, and perhaps finally to heal. This physical evidence directly contradicted Bracken's narrative and strongly suggested captivity and abuse. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no definitive proof that Bracken had murdered Olia. They emphasized the lack of DNA evidence linking Bracken to the crime, attributing it to the degradation of the remains and the aggressive cleaning of the bunkhouse. But the totality of the evidence was too compelling. The combination of the location of the body, the trace evidence, the autopsy findings indicating sexual abuse and blunt force trauma, and the discovery of the restraints created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Sterling Bracken was found guilty on all counts: kidnapping, sexual abuse, and felony murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The case closed on the dual tragedy uncovered by the anomalous sound of a damaged SOS beacon. The chance discovery by the acoustic researchers had set in motion a chain of events that revealed the horrifying truth about the disappearance of Imagigenis and Olia Kasperi. Imagigen Velis remains entombed within the sealed Utah mine. Her final resting place marked only by the vast silent expanse of the desert. A decision made by her father Rowan to protect others from the same fate. Olia Kasperi survived the initial ordeal, emerging from the darkness with a fierce will to live, only to meet a horrific end at the hands of an opportunistic predator in the remote, unforgiving wilderness. This is just the beginning of the mystery. Like this video if you want to see how it unfolds. Whether they sought shelter in the public use cabin. They had used the cabin before. It was a familiar location in their hunting territory. Shortly after their arrival, Kaylin, Quaid, and Barron arrived, also seeking refuge from the storm. The cabin was small, forcing the three of them to share the space. Yardley noted that Kaylin was friendly and seemed to trust them. He speculated that she perhaps felt secure because they presented as a non-threatening gay couple, perceiving them as fellow travelers rather than a danger. They shared the space, the atmosphere initially cordial. They shared the cabin for several hours, the storm raging outside. Kaylin, exhausted from her hike, eventually fell asleep. Yardley stated that she felt safe enough to pack away her handgun, leaving it inaccessible in her backpack. It was then that Yardley and Xavier made their move. According to Yardley, they viewed Colleen's unexpected arrival as an opportunity. They saw her as a sacrifice for their personalized satanic rituals. While she slept, they attacked her, strangling her to death. The act was methodical, ritualistic, fulfilling a dark imperative of their belief system. The attack was sudden and violent. But they hadn't accounted for Barron. The dog, loyal and protective, immediately reacted to the assault on Kaylin. Barron viciously defended her, lunging at Yardley and mauling his arm, inflicting the deep wounds that resulted in the extensive scarring. The attack enraged Yardley. The pain was intense, and the interference of the dog fueled a desire for revenge. He saw the fire burning in the fireplace, which they had started earlier to warm the cabin. In an act of calculated horrific cruelty, they forced the injured and terrified dog into the fireplace. They didn't just want to kill the dog, they wanted it to suffer. Barron, desperate to escape the flames, immediately tried to scramble up the chimney shaft. Yardley and Xavier then climbed onto the roof. They took the heavy metal chimney cap and sealed the opening, trapping the dog inside. They ensured that the dog burned alive and suffocated as it desperately tried to claw its way upwards, its final moments marked by agony and terror. The horrific death of the dog was both an act of revenge and a twisted offering. With Kaylin dead and the dog disposed of, they set about erasing any trace of her presence. They hid her backpack in the crawl space, taking the handgun as a trophy. They also removed the log book from the cabin, ensuring there was no record of their stay. They then transported Colleen's body back to their farm. Yardley concluded his confession by revealing the location where they had disposed of Kaylin's body. She was buried in a remote section of their extensive farm property. The confession was complete, horrifying, and provided the closure that Owen Vance had desperately sought for 6 years. Following Deacon Yardley's detailed confession, authorities organized an immediate search of the designated location on the vast farm property. Utilizing cadaver dogs and heavy excavation equipment, the search team focused on the remote area identified by Yardley. After several hours of searching, the remains of Kaylin Quaid were recovered. The discovery finally brought an end to the 6-year mystery of her disappearance, confirming the horrific fate that had befallen her in the remote Montana wilderness. The legal process moved swiftly in the wake of the confession and the recovery of the remains. Deacon Yardley, seeking to avoid the death penalty, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated animal cruelty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Xavier maintained his silence throughout the proceedings. He went to trial, his defense attempting to shift the blame entirely onto Yardley. However, the physical evidence recovered from the farm, the matching symbols connecting them to the crime scene and the testimony provided by Yardley detailing their joint actions were overwhelming. Xavier was found guilty on all counts and was also sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The resolution of the case provided Owen Vance with the devastating answers he had sought for 6 years. The wilderness had not claimed Kaylin. She had fallen victim to a calculated ritualistic act of violence perpetrated by 2 men who had hidden their dark secrets behind a facade of normalcy. In the aftermath of the convictions, investigators scrutinized the extensive evidence of ritualistic activities found on the farm. Given the organized nature of their practices, the isolation of their property, and the calculated cruelty displayed in the murder of Kaylin and the torture of Barron, authorities suspected that Yardley and Xavier might be responsible for other murders. However, despite extensive investigation, no evidence was ever found to link them to any other cases. The full extent of their activities remained confined to the isolated farm, their secrets buried along with their victim.